Welcome to today's webinar on unpacking the CMMC Final Rule and what contractors need to know about this final rule. So the final rule was published by the Department of Defense, and it's a critical milestone for organizations that handle controlled unclassified information. This regulation is set to take effect on December 16th, 2024, and it marks a pivotal moment in the defense industry's approach to cybersecurity. The changes introduced by this regulation are significant, especially for those aiming to achieve CMMC Level 2 compliance. Today, we will dive into the key requirements of this new regulation, including the role of third-party assessments, what compliance score is deemed compliant, what's the responsibilities and compliance obligations of cloud service providers and external service providers like MSPs. It's important to note that a phased rollout of these requirements is expected to begin as early as the second quarter of 2025. So the time to prepare is obviously now, and that makes this webinar pretty timely. Our panel of experts will break down the timeline, followed by the key compliance requirements and the assessment process. So to demystify and decode this, we have a panel of 4 experts. 2 of them are from Redspin, a leading CMMC third-party certified assessment organization, and 2 from PreVeil. Dr. Thomas Graham is Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at Redspin, a leading CMMC C3PAO. He's a recognized expert in CMMC and holds the Certified Assessor credential, as well as the CMMC Certified Professional credentials. Dr. Graham played a key role in Redspin becoming the first authorized C3PAO and has overseen several DIBCAC High and CMMC assessments. He has a PhD in Information Assurance and Security and leads the internal security efforts at Redspin. Robert Teague is a seasoned CMMC certified assessor. He has over 30 years of cybersecurity and IT leadership experience. He specializes in helping clients prepare for and achieve CMMC certifications with a focus on long-term compliance. Robert's expertise ensures clients are well prepared to meet CMMC requirements and secure their contracts. Noelle Westall is PreVeil's Chief Compliance Officer and a CMMC certified professional as well. She has successfully guided numerous customers through DIBCAC High and CMMC JSV assessments. She's an expert in NIST 800-171, and in a previous role, Noelle personally led an organization's implementation of NIST 800-171 to full compliance with all 110 controls. And finally, we have Jamie Leopold, who's Director of Partnerships at PreVeil, and also a CMMC certified professional, a CCP. He helps partners and end customers of PreVeil achieve compliance and has been involved in the CMMC program since its very inception. My name is Sanjeev Verma. I'm Chairman and Co-founder of PreVeil, which, as several of you know, provides end-to-end encrypted email file sharing to store and protect CUI, as well as complete documentation to help you become compliant. So with that as a backdrop, let's roll into it. So the CMMC timeline and rollout is our first topic of interest. And the first question goes out to the Redspin team. The rule introduces a 4-phase rollout, which will be accomplished over 4 years. Could you explain the timeline and what each phase entails? And perhaps even before we go into the timeline, maybe we speak to the immediate timeline that leads up to the first phase. And maybe I could set the stage for that, which is that, as you know, the Rule 30, CFR 32, which is the final rule, is now published. It's going to go into effect on December 16th of 2024. And then there's a parallel rule that's called CFR 48, which authorizes the DoD to insert CMMC into contracts. And its comment period just ended, and we expect sometime in early summer of next year that regulation will take into effect. And at that point, CMMC will start entering contracts. But it's important to note that effective December 16th, as we understand it, assessments can commence. So with that backdrop, over to you, our friends at Redspin, to tell us about what's this 4-phase rollout and what should folks expect.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you guys for inviting us to another webinar. We love doing these with you and the listeners out there. You are absolutely correct. The CFR 32 rule, which is the CMMC rule itself, does have an effective date of 16 December. The 4-phased approach, and back up real quick, that means any assessments for CMMC can begin on that date. That's level 1 or level 2. There was some confusion when the 32 rule came out for public comments, all surrounding the phases. There's 4 phased approaches. This, for some reason, we were tied to the 32 rule, and we thought, okay, so we can't start certifications until phase 1 completes, and then we can kick in phase 2. With the rule coming out and being published here, they have now clarified that the phased approaches are tied to that 48 CFR rule that you mentioned, Sanjeev. So really, this is talking about when do you expect to see CMMC verbiage in contracts. If we lay this out in common terms, December 16, 2024, assessments can begin for level 1 and 2. When the CFR 48 rule is published to the register, it will have an effective date very similar to the 32 rule. That effective date starts phase 1. Phase 1 is for them to go into all the level 1 contracts and start inserting the CMMC verbiage. They extended that from a 6-month period to a 1-year period. And then phase 2 kicks in 1 year after phase 1 begins, which was the effective date of the 48 rule. That's now going to be all the level 2 stuff. Phase 3 commences 1 year after phase 2 started. That's where you're going to see CMMC level 3 verbiage start to come into contracts. We should see a clear CMMC level 3 assessment should have already begun by then. So we'll see how that plays out. And then the final phase 4 is the full implementation of CMMC, and that begins 1 calendar year following the start date of phase 3. So hopefully everybody followed all that. And Thomas, do you have anything you want to add to it?
No, the biggest thing, as you kind of pointed out, Rob, is everybody's interested in 32 CFR. It's been a long time coming. But from the contractual enforcement and that actual implementation, 48 CFR is the one that's going to be the driver there, because the 32 CFR rule indicates that the phases, as you mentioned, won't start until 48 CFR is final. And as Sanjeev mentioned, right now it's anticipated that 48 CFR will go final in second quarter of calendar year 2025.
So I think I want to dig into this a little bit more, because I think you guys are all, PhDs in CFRs and 48s and 32s and so forth, but the audience is wanting to kind of understand, what does this simply mean? So I want to emphasize over here, for a level 2 assessment, can it begin on December 16th, 2024?
The answer is yes, Sanjeev.
Okay. So what this is saying is that, organizations that seek level 2 certification will start commencing. Those assessments can be scheduled and commence on December 16th, 2024. The contractual obligations inserted into contracts is sometime in Q2 2025. That's when the CFR 48 comes in. But regardless, what it means is that the program is on its way, and organizations that seek to participate in contracts that require CMMC during phase 1, which will start sometime in second quarter or so, they must get ready to participate in those, because if they wait till then, it's too late. Am I misstating it? Am I incorrect in any way?
No, I think you're spot on, Sanjeev. The confusion between the 32 and 48 rule, and to help alleviate that, the 32 rule is CMMC itself. It contains the 19, 20, and 21 DFARS clauses. The 19 allow opening the doors for the DoD to come into your organization for physical components, and the others are all make up 32. 32 is the CMMC rule. 48 is the complementary rule that it's tied to verbiage in contracts. So if you think of 32 as the rule, 48 is the verbiage. That should help you kind of lay things out. However, they are tied together. The DoD and the Cyber AB have mentioned that 48 CFR does not have to be final for the 32 CFR rule to begin. So thus, as you mentioned, Sanjeev, 16 December can begin those level 1 and level 2 assessments. As we see 48 get published, we'll see an effective date. From that effective date starts phase 1, and then you'll do the 1 years from each of those dates for each phase.
Perfect. And let's talk a little bit about like phase 1, which would be like mid 2025 to mid 2026. And in that phase, as we understand it, they're saying that several contracts could basically be requiring CMMC level 2 certifications. And those contracts could either be satisfied with a self-assessment at level 2 or a C3PO assessment at level 2. And the DoD reserves the right to ask for either of those. Am I misunderstanding it?
Sanjeev, you said that better than I could have. Eloquently said, yes.
So let's move on to the next thing. So the CFR 32 rule, which is the CMMC rule, now is the definitive rule that basically outlines the key requirements for CMMC level 2 compliance. So since this webinar's focus is level 2, could you tell us what are the key requirements that an organization seeking level 2 compliance must satisfy now that the rule is super clear?
As far as the rules that organizations have to comply with, keep in mind that the requirements, and I know we've said this before on these webinars, Sanjeev, the requirements are DFARS, DFARS 7012. They've been there. CMMC is just the validation component. And when organizations will be held accountable to the validation component depends upon which level of CMMC and which phase it pertains to. So level 1, yes, you're squarely in the crosshairs starting in calendar year 2025. Level 2, you may, and I stress may, not be in the crosshairs until phase 2 starts, which, probably be in 2026 at some point. I stress may because there is a couple of sentences in the rule that gives PMOs and contracting officers latitude to require the CMMC certification or attestation prior to the phased implementation timeframe. So just because, I need phase 2, I'm not going to have to deal with it until 2026, that's not necessarily the case. So just please be aware of that.
So from the perspective of the PreVeil team, I'd like Noel and Jamie, you to address, the key requirements. We assume that, everybody understands these things, but it'd be helpful to understand what exactly do you mean by, I am achieving level 2 compliance? What are the requirements?
It's a great question. For those of you who aren't familiar with CMMC level 2, it does require complete full implementation. So that's a keyword, full implementation of all 110 NIST 800-171 revision 2 controls. So DoD did codify in a memo a couple months ago now, and also again in CFR 32, the final rule for CMMC, that you are going to have the 110 fully implemented if you have a DFAR 7012 clause like you always have. Then you're also going to have to get some sort of assertion of that by, for example, a C3PO like Thomas or Rob. That's not going to be in the first phase, but that is the eventual rollout of all of this, is to then get someone to come in and validate that you've actually completed all of those 110 controls fully implemented.
Let's go to the next depth of this. So I think, yes, you got to go and implement the 110 controls, but what about the minimum score requirements to achieve CMMC level 2 compliance?
So that's another great question. So the CMMC rule codified what we've seen, sort of floating around, which is the 88 out of 110 score. So in order to be considered for, the ability to have a POAM, which is a plan of actions and milestone, let's say, for example, that you get into an assessment and you have 1 or 2 controls that are partially implemented but not fully, and they're on the list of approved controls that could be listed as a POEM item or an item that you will take action on after the assessment. And it's a very tiny list, like very, very small. I mean, you see Rob nodding his head. It's a very small number of those controls. And you still have to have them at least partially implemented. You can't just have nothing done on these controls. But 88 is the bare minimum of fully implemented controls that you can have. And then possibly you can POEM the others, depending.
So let's be clear that as we understand it, the list, even though it's small, it's a series of 1-point controls.
Correct.
But it is correct, is it not, to say that if you strive for achievement of compliance, if you hit the 88 threshold and you've implemented the controls that basically you're not allowed to have a POEM on, and have some implementation on the controls that you are allowed to have a POEM on, that would enable you to get a level 2 certification. And then there's some period by which you can then complete those POEMs.
Correct. So there's 180 days for any of those POEMs that you do end up with post-assessment. So that's 6 months. That's the standard that the Joint Surveillance Voluntary Assessment has done with C3POs and DIBCAC, and they went ahead and codified that in the rule and actually spelled that out. So that is now the official law.
So I'm a big fan of, a prayer has to be heard many different times in many different ways before it sort of sinks in. So I'm going to ask our friends at Redspin, could you kindly again elucidate on this very important point of what is this magical 88 number and how does it pertain to a threshold for compliance, and what about these POEMs? Let's hear it said a different way.
So 88 is a number, but it's combining two numbers, both of them as 8, and it's this magical threshold that you have to reach. Essentially, it's 80%. The number, and honestly, Sanjeev, I still don't have a good understanding of why the DoD started at negative numbering and then went up to 110. That still escapes me. When you start a CMMC assessment at level 2, you start with a score of 110. And then as you're going through the assessment for any practice or requirement, as it's termed, since the rule's been finalized, for any of those requirements that you receive a not met on, points are deducted. And understand, you can receive a not met based on just not meeting a specific objective. So if you're just looking at NIST 800-171 Rev 2, you're doing yourself a disservice. Go look at the CMMC Level 2 Assessment Guide. Some of the requirements only have one objective. I think one in CM has A through O objectives listed for it. And if you miss just one of those objectives, you receive a not met for the entire requirement. And if it's a one-pointer, yeah, sure, you can miss up to 12 one-pointers and you can still go to POEM. But keep in mind, most of the one-pointers are documentation only. They don't really speak to the configuration items. And it's very easy to, your documentation say, absolutely, I'm FIPS 140-2 validated. An assessor comes in, looks for the configuration on that encryption. It doesn't meet the NIST validation requirements, and all of a sudden, now you've got a configuration item missed, and you could be looking at having to go through the process all over again.
Now, there is, if I can jump in, Sanjeev, one kind of exception, if you will, and that is for SC.L2-3.1311, which is the FIPS validated module itself. If for some reason you do not have that FIPS check block enabled for that, that is a not met requirement. But as long as AES 256 encryption is in place, you can get a 3-point score for it versus the 5. So that would still be allowed in a POEM. That's the only 5-point item allowed.
So again, I want to belabor this point. I'm sorry. A lot of the audience over here is small and medium businesses, not particularly well-versed with the jargon of it. And from a practical perspective, understanding everything that Noel and you have shared with them, they say, look, I want to be compliant. And one way for them to look at it is, oh, I got to get a 110 out of a 110. Of course, that would be awesome, that if they got a 110 out of 110. But another way to kind of think about it would be, well, here's the bare minimum that I need to get, which is an 88. I recognize the ones that are documentation related, and I have a little bit of time to go in and fix those things. Would that be an unreasonable assumption or an unreasonable approach for a small and medium business?
Oh boy, that's a really great question, Sanjeev. I have my personal opinion on it. That is definitely one way to tackle it. I will remind everybody that NEST 800-171 Revision 2 is basic, just basic requirements. This should be a foundational start for organizations, and you should build on top of that, right? So you should never stop trying to achieve, security. And this world is always changing. We know that. Items change, threats change. So you have to constantly reassess that network and that environment and make those adjustments to ensure that data is being protected. I would say that if you're coming in, and it's just kind of like I told my soldiers when I was in the Army, what's the minimum score for a physical fitness test? You shouldn't be looking at the minimum score. You should be looking at what the max is, because that you should always be striving for excellence. That the same applies here. So I would highly recommend strive for that 110. And then on top of that, once your certification is complete, start prepping for NEST 800-171 Revision 3, because eventually, sometime down that 3-year period, it's going to come into play. But we've seen folks tackle this all different kinds of ways, Sanjeev.
Right. Well, I wholeheartedly second the approach of, striving for excellence over here. I do have one soft spot over here for the small and medium business that is coming at it with a whole mountain of these objectives and compliance requirements. And so from a pragmatic perspective, I think what my takeaway from your answer is put all the systems that protect the CUI in there, strive for 110 and see the best that you can do, but don't ignore, putting systems in place to protect CUI. But you do have some latitude. It's not perfection on day one.
Correct.
So let's take the other notion that you talked about, which is the continual improvement over here. There is this notion in the final rule of annual reaffirmations. Again, some might think I do one thing and then I can forget about it for the next 3 years. What is this annual reaffirmation business, and why is it important, and what does it entail in terms of an organization, the practical steps that they have to take to keep themselves compliant?
Okay, I'll start, and then you guys can jump in where you see fit. Again, this is just our interpretation. I don't know all of the details that the DoD kind of looked at to put this requirement in place. But the self-attestation annually is going to do a few things for the organizations and the DoD. One, it's going to let the DoD know that they're maintaining compliance with their certification they just completed. That paints a picture for them over the 3-year period of, can the organization sustain that compliancy without a lot of stress, loss of funds, etc., resources, those kinds of things. So that's one. Two is that, we just completed our recertification, and in prep for that took us, Thomas, myself, and our admin almost 3 months of just ensuring artifacts were met with the, tied to the documentation. That is not a dance you want to do every 3 years, because it's very stressful. I mean, we're Redspin, the first authorized C3PAO, but you're fooling yourself if you didn't think we were stressing as well. Any assessment is stressful, right? So it avoids that mad rush of prepping for that recertification. But mostly what that attestation is going to do for the DoD is let them know they're maintaining compliance. Now, we do get a lot of questions, Sanjeev, about, well, we've been putting off a network refresh upgrade because of this certification. Now that that's done, we want to update our network devices, but that's going to take us out of the 110 compliance. The DoD is aware of that. That's why POEMs come into play. So if you're doing a refresh upgrade on your switches and routers, you POAM that, you go into SPRS, put what that score currently is, and when you get done updating it, you go back into SPRS and replace your score to 110.
So Noel, you've been the author of a lot of compliance documentation that, PreVeil provides customers. And sometimes, you get the question, well, I could just use it, get compliant in year one, and then I can forget about it. What are the obligations that this reaffirmation entails on the organization seeking compliance of keeping their documentation current?
Absolutely. Yeah, I get that. I get that question a lot from people. Well, hey, I've implemented everything. I'm done now. We're good, right? And to Rob's point, Absolutely not. When you start your CMMC journey, the start is the implementation, but it is a continuous. You are constantly going to be under this CMMC umbrella with all the protections that are required within. So yeah, I personally think, and I tell customers this all the time, as we have seen, CMMC has changed so much. I started with CMMC version 1.3 is what I implemented. So this was 4 years ago now? Gosh, yeah. Robin Thomas know too. We've been with this since the beginning. It has changed and adjusted and shifted over and over and over again. My comment to those people who are thinking, oh yeah, well, I'm just one and done. It's going to change more. We already know. We just talked about revision 3 is going to be a requirement at some point. And we know that that's going to be a requirement probably sooner rather than later. It's not going to be in 6 years. It's probably going to be in 2. So I definitely always urge customers to make sure that they are constantly keeping that CMMC assessment at top of mind. Because to Rob's point, if you don't do that, you're scrambling every single time you have to do that self-attestation, every time you have to do that C3PAO evaluation. And there are some really steep, pretty hefty fines and legal issues that can come if you start lying on these different things. As we've all heard in the news, there have been multiple different companies who have already gone through issues with the DoD and the DOJ because of not being 100% honest in their self-attestations.
Ask for a point of clarification because the Rev 2 versus Rev 3 is certainly one of the most frequent questions that we receive. And I just want to make sure that we're kind of all, in agreement and in alignment. But, with the DoD coming out and saying that Rev 3 will be introduced in rulemaking versus just another memo, that would lead me to believe that they're going to allow CMMC program to become more formalized, because they're going to have to go essentially for a CMMC 3.0 would be my understanding. It's going to have to be part of rulemaking versus just, switching over a memo. So I would estimate that it's going to be 3-4 years down the road before Rev 3 really takes hold. I don't know what other folks.
No, that's right, Jamie, because if you look at the rule, and honestly, if you look at DFAR 7012, they have hard-coded NIST 800-171 Rev 2 into both of those documents. For Rev 3 to take effect, my understanding, if I understand rulemaking correctly, and granted we're talking the DoD, so that's questionable any given day, for it to change to Rev 3, there would have to be another rulemaking action. And let's be honest, how long have we been waiting for 32 CFR to come out now? I expect it at some point in time. I play devil's advocate. I wouldn't expect it until the end of the phased rollout, but that's just my personal opinion.
But I think as an important point to conclude over here is, I think if you're an organization seeking compliance, focus on Rev 2 because that's what's required right now. And don't, again, look at it as, Rev 3 could be coming. Let me wait for Rev 3 to come. Because for the foreseeable future, you're going to be assessed on Rev 2.
Great, Sanjeev. And also, don't start applying Rev 3 now because your assessment's Rev 2, not Rev 3.
That's a really good point. And the other thing to remember too is that Rev 3 does have updates, but all the things that you're doing for Rev 2 will still be in Rev 3. So that's something to really remember. You're adding on, like what you said, Rob, about how, NIST 800-171 Rev 2 was really the basic foundation. Rev 3 is adding a little bit more onto that.
I want to now go back to this question because to ensure that everybody's getting it clear that at level 2, the basic CMMC program is going to require C3PAO assessments. Now, in phase 1, there may be some contracts that say, okay, you could self-certify, but in essence, there is no getting around a C3PAO assessment to be CMMC level 2 certified. Can you, for one more time, explain what's the difference between a self-assessment and a C3PAO assessment when it pertains to CMMC level 2?
It just depends on if you get to see Rob's shining face or not. That's the biggest difference, Sanjeev.
Okay, great.
So I'm being sarcastic, but a self-assessment is honestly what it sounds like. You utilize the CMMC Level 2 assessment guide, and you go through and you conduct an assessment on your scoped boundary based upon that assessment guide. Once it's completed, the score that's generated from that is what will get uploaded into SPRS, and then it will have to be signed off on in some way, shape, or form by the affirming official for your organization. The 32 CFR rule did provide a little bit more clarity on who that individual has to be. The specifics on how they will go about it, honestly, we don't know yet because SPRS hasn't been updated.
Yeah, I think, but it's important to recognize, even in the limited cases where you're doing self-assessment for few of the phase one, contracts, there's a legal requirement and a legal threshold that a senior executive of the company has to affirm that what this self-assessment is revealing is a truthful and honest score. Otherwise, there are consequences associated with it.
There absolutely are. And again, playing devil's advocate, whoever's signing their name to it, if something happens and Department of Justice starts looking at them for potentially false claims, that's going to be the first person they're going to want to talk to.
Well, and we get a lot of questions on, are we level 1? Are we level 2? Can we self-attest? Do we need a C3PAO? The answer to that is contact the POC for the contract itself. They have the details. If you can't glean it from the contract, they will have the details for you that would paint that picture. Level 1 is really no different than what everybody's doing right now is self-assessments. But again, it's tied to an executive has to sign off on that. For those organizations that find themselves requiring a C3PAO to conduct their assessments, you need to contact them now, especially if you plan on being assessed at sometime calendar year 2025, because a lot of the C3PAO's calendars are filling up, and some are blocked all the way up until summer of 2025.
I'm going to come back to this question of contacting C3PAOs, but since we are here to demystify the regulation, I'm going to move to the next thing that the ruling clarified. So a lot of organizations are going to use cloud service providers and external service providers like MSPs and MSSPs to help them meet, several of those requirements. My first question is for Noel. For organizations that rely on cloud service providers, what specific regulations must those cloud service providers meet for handling CUI?
Absolutely. So that actually hasn't changed in the rule because that has been codified in DFAR 7012 for, 7 years now. And what it states is that if you are using a cloud service provider that is processing, storing, and transmitting CUI, that's the key. So this is, only inside of your CMMC compliance boundary. If you're using a CSP for processing, storing, and transmitting of CUI, they have to either be FedRAMP authorized, meaning on the FedRAMP marketplace, they sell directly to the government, or like what PreVeil is, FedRAMP equivalent. And there now has been a definition for FedRAMP equivalency that the DoD came out with earlier this year as well.
Let's move on to the next question, which is what's an external service provider and what regulatory requirements apply to ESPs? So Jamie, would you please take what's an ESP? Give us an example of an ESP and how did the ruling get clarified for external service providers? Think of a small business trying to get compliant.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So an external service provider would be either third-party service or in many cases an MSP, MSSP that is not directly part of the contractor's own information system, but they're leveraging the services from the third party. They can also be a cloud service, for example. I think the important distinction that the DoD did finally codify in CFR 32 is that if you're using an external service provider and they are not a cloud service provider that stores, processes, transmits CUI, as Noel just alluded to, any other external service provider does not require their own CMMC certification. It doesn't mean that they don't have to meet the requirements because they will be part of your assessment scope, assuming they either store, process CUI or provide security protection for assets that store, process CUI. So they'll still be part of your assessment scope, but they've lessened the burden on ESPs, external service providers, by not requiring them to independently get their own certification. They can volunteer to do that, and many probably will because it might be more cost effective for them to do that than to sit in on a number of assessments. But the nice thing is they've given them that option.
So I want to go back to this in a little bit more detail. Again, what does an MSP or an MSSP provide for CMMC compliance in general cases for an organization seeking compliance?
Yeah, so generally speaking, they could be, helping them in a number of ways, but typically managed service providers, in order to be considered an ESP, would be doing something on a recurring basis. They might be providing, some sort of SIM services. They might be providing vulnerability management for them, just as a couple of examples of an ESP that would also be providing security protection assets. But ultimately, they're providing services on behalf of the customer's environment.
Thomas, you were eloquent in describing that, yes, external service provider is not required to have their own certification, but that may be a moot point for most external service providers, because if they choose not to get that certification, they got to be part of every single assessment for every customer that uses them. So tell us a little bit about that, because I think that it's an important thing for any MSP or MSSP that's listening in, who's thinking that, well, great, I don't need to be, certified. But is it truly that they don't need to be certified?
In short, yes, it's true. They don't have to be certified if they don't store, process, transmit CUI. And of course, that speaks to FedRAMP if you're a CSP. But you're absolutely correct. If you don't get certified yourself, then potentially you could have questions thrown your way from every single one of your customers that go through assessment, which means you would have to potentially allocate resources and employees or time to answer those questions. And it could be specific time frames. How many customers, does an average ESP have? Let's just say 10. Well, potentially you could have to allocate an employee for 1 week for each single assessment for each of those 10. So 10 weeks now out of the year, you're pulling that employee out of actually performing their day-to-day jobs. Now, just one quick thing, Sanjeev, if they want to go through certification, the 32 CFR rule doesn't specifically say they can't, but if they have it, then that provides something for their customers to be able to say, here's our shared responsibility matrix for the areas that we're responsible for. We've been verified and validated by a third-party C3PAO. I've got work to do. Call me if there's any issues.
And you're done. Let me again belabor this point. Sorry, I love to belabor points over here. Let's say that I am an external service provider and I choose not to become level 2 certified. Okay. Does it mean that I have no requirement to meet any of the NIST 800-171 controls? Or do I need to still meet those controls because I'm part of the customer's compliance boundary?
For the customer's perspective, you absolutely need to do it now. Are you contractually enforced? Depends on what's in your contract. There's somebody posted a question in the Q&A, wanting to talk about, if you're an antivirus, if you're a security provider that provides antivirus services, does that put you in scope? Antivirus is probably categorized as security protection data, which would fall under that category of ESP that we're just talking about. So if they're a third party managing that or providing it in a cloud service, for instance, at minimum, you got to have that responsibility matrix defined, and more than likely, you're going to have to provide answers for their assessment.
So I'm going to create a hypothetical scenario for you. Let's say I own a small ball bearing manufacturing shop. I use an external service provider, and I use certain, services from them for two-factor or, whatever, antivirus. And I show up at your doorstep to say, hey, assess me. And you look at, what I have done, but now I have the external service provider that's doing all these things. And the external service provider says, I did nothing in terms of protecting NIST 800, these things via NIST 800-171. Am I passing or am I failing?
Well, it depends on if they're being truthful when they're telling you that they've not done anything. I can tell you, Sanjeev, I was at Security Congress earlier this week, and I was talking with identity providers that same business line as what you're mentioning. They are scrambling now to be able to provide evidence that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing.
In essence, they are not absolved of their responsibilities to, adhere to NIST 800-171. It's just that they have to make a decision whether I just go on a case-by-case basis and support my customer's compliance or just get CMMC Level 2 certified myself, in which case it becomes a piece of cake and I just provide my certification to the customer's assessment.
And remember, this is a business decision for Sanjeev, because if they do get certified, you're opening the doors for more DoD contractors to come to you to manage their environment. So if you don't get certified, you could close yourself off to that. So keep that in mind as part of your decision-making process.
Let's now move on to the next big topic, which is flow down requirements. Is there any change in terms of flow down requirements with the CMMC Final Rule? What is this flow down requirement business, and what should an organization know about it?
So I guess I can start this one off. So the flow down requirements, the only difference in the rule is that there's a lot more clarity about it and how to go about doing it. So for those prime contractors that are out there and flowing down requirements, make sure you pay attention to that portion of the rule. We have already seen and heard from folks out there that are reaching out to us that the primes have already reached out to them and notified them that the CMMC rule has been posted to the register and you need to start making your efforts now to get compliant. So we're seeing an uptick of a lot of subs starting to reach out now, some of which were naysayers that thought this wouldn't happen. Others are, the primes told us to wait until the rule was published. It's now published. They've given us the green light to move ahead. So it just depends, but pay attention in that rule because it has the DoD did a phenomenal job. Now there's still some confusing pieces in there, but they did a phenomenal job describing how to flow those requirements down.
And to add on to that really quickly, because when we were talking about the phases in the beginning, that's all direct prime contracts. So that's all directly from the DoD contract to the prime. The prime contract to the sub, they can ask for you to be compliant and get a C3 PAO assessment next year. They could ask, that is a completely different thing. So that's something to be really aware of, is that if you're a subcontractor, what your prime is asking from you may be different than what's in the final rule, and they get to do that. So something to definitely be aware of too.
That's a very important point that you made, Noel, and this leads me to the question that I had parked earlier on reaching out to C3PAO. So several people that heard you guys speak in the earlier part of this webinar say, hey, listen, I heard this is a 4-phase thing and phase 1 begins next summer. That's great. I should just, wait till maybe next December or 2026. So I'm going to ask friends at Redspin, is that a wise strategy? Are they misunderstanding this phase business? How would you think about it?
Yeah, so if you read phase 1, and I have it up, so I'm going to read it verbatim to you. And this is out of paragraph 170.3, applicability. And then you go down to number 1, phase 1 begins on the effective date of the complementary 48 CFR Part 204 CMMC Acquisition Final Rule. So again, there's a lot of confusion when the rule came out for public comments. We all thought that was tied to CMMC assessments, and we had to wait until phase 1 was done before we can start level 2s. This has nothing to do with that. Right now, the primes, as Noel has mentioned, can say, hey, are you CMMC certified? If not, you're gone. I'm grabbing somebody else that is. That's one scenario, right? So, but the main thing, the phases are tied to the documentation and those contracts. And I noticed somebody put in a question. I was going to answer it, but I knew you were going to drive to it, Sanjeev, so we're answering it live. That you've got to watch for the effective date that comes out in the 48 rule when it gets published. And what they're going to do over that first year is they're going to take all the level 1 contracts and update those with the verbiage. Phase 2 will be all the level 2 stuff, and phase 3 will be all the level 3 stuff. Some point in all of that, they're going to go back to current contract that are active right now, and they will rewrite those. So yes, eventually, by the time phase 4 starts, you're talking full implementation. CMMC is in all the contracts, but don't make the mistake that you can't get certified because those start this calendar year on December 16th.
And again, I'm the mythical ball bearing manufacturer, and I am obviously looking because I don't enjoy this business of getting compliant and stuff. Nobody does. It's work. So I want to defer this thing. I don't want to do anything about this thing. And I asked Noel and I asked you guys, should I defer? What's your answer? What are practical reasons that you would give to them that says, hey, here's why you ought to defer, and here's the reason why it's a bad idea to defer?
So, deferring, Sanjeev, that goes back to Rob's point on a business decision. If you defer, what does that mean? Well, depending upon when you're wanting to defer to, a C3PO may not have bandwidth to provide you with that certification at that particular time. So if you are wanting to defer, I would say still start talking to C3POs now and seeing what it would take to secure whatever date you're thinking of. The other risk to deferring is, what if a contract drops that you want to bid on that's got the requirement in there, but all of a sudden now you've deferred, you don't have that certification? That's the biggest,
I wanted to clarify on, because, nobody knows which contract's going to ask for CMMC in the early phases. And therefore, a reason to defer is effectively saying, I'm going to sit those contracts out. And so the more you defer, the more you're effectively saying, I don't want to play in these contracts. Let's say I want to defer till 2027. Am I basically saying I am sitting it out for contracts in 2025 and 2026? Is that basically what this thing means?
If they have the CMMC requirement in there, yes, that's the short answer.
And the second part of it is an equally short answer. What if the primes, as you say, ask for, hey, I want you to be part of a bidding process, but my bidding requirements for you, even if the contract doesn't ask for CMMC, is you got to be certified. Is that a possibility?
That is absolutely a possibility. I know I was answering one of the questions in the Q&A again, and understand that what we're talking about with 32 CFR and 48 CFR, those are just the contractual requirements, the enforcement mechanisms. If you're part of a team for a prime or you're sub to a prime, there's no limitations on what that prime is going to require for the members of the organizations that ride that contract with. They may, regardless of if you only have FCI, they may say, nope, if you're going to be part of this contract, you got to be level 2, because in their eyes, when they go to submit their bid, that provides them with more quals or potentially more points for their bid. So it gives them a better ability, in their opinion, to win that contract.
So in my sort of, I'm a simple-minded person. So in my simple-minded thinking, there's a distinction I draw between being prepared and being assessed. So there appears to me to be absolutely no case for an organization not to be prepared. You can still make a call whether I'll get assessed in the first half of next year or the latter half of next year or early 2026. But is there a case that says, let me defer preparation also?
Preparing, no. And in short, and I know Rob or Noel's probably chomping at the bit for this one. The reason why I say that is, understand, CMMC is just the validation component. The requirements, as I think Noel mentioned this earlier, have been around since December 31st of 2017. Every contract that has been signed since that date with DFAR 7012 requirements in there has been the organization saying, yes, I already comply with all 110. And that's the concern. You see a lot of times, you see right now, the government is starting to inquire about organizations that have said they've done this, something's happened, and it turns out they actually haven't had them in place, and they're saying, why not? You've been accepting the contract saying that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. The fact that this has been a requirement for so long, and there were so many people who just said in spurs, yeah, I'm 110 out of 110 and didn't think anything of it, is exactly why CMMC exists in the first place. So that's something to remember. This, like what Thomas just said, this is already your requirement. This is already something you have to get done. Waiting is just going to put you in a more risk, extremely high risk situation where the DoD and the DIBCAC, which is the DoD's assessment branch, they're looking for people who have been lying about this and not actually telling them the truth. And again, there's been so many examples and articles of different companies who've gotten caught up in what's called the False Claims Act, which when you sign that contract, to Thomas's point, you've been signing it every year and getting that money, you are attesting again that you've done this. So when they find out that you don't, there's some very, very steep penalties you can face.
And the other piece to that, Sanjeev, is what Noel mentioned or referenced earlier, is that the primes They can come out right now and start enforcement now. We haven't seen that with the term enforcement. We have seen effective date is this date. You need to start getting on the schedule of a C3PAO to get your certification lined up. So if they continue to kick that can down the road, they're either going to lose business or lose that contract. Both are detrimental to their organizations.
I'm coming down to my last 3 questions over here. The first one goes to you, Noel. 2 minutes for you. The intent of list 800-171 wasn't to kind of disrupt your workflows, but to ensure that, if you're using computers, you continue to use them and you do so in a manner that meets 800-171. Many people are terrified with, there are all these endpoint controls and how do I meet them? And there's just terror just using this word. Can you tell us how endpoint controls can be met on a computer by an organization? Is that terrorizing or is it just straightforward activity?
I absolutely, I'd be happy to demystify this a little bit. So it really, an endpoint, for those out there who don't know what that is, that's a laptop or a desktop that you're accessing the CUI on. Because remember, processing, storing, and transmitting CUI, that's where we have to protect it. The minute that you are accessing, you're processing. So if you look at CUI on a computer, that computer is now considered a CUI asset and has to be compliantly hardened. And those are the big sort of technologies that are a part of that are vulnerability scanning, looking for vulnerabilities on your network. Then you have antivirus, anti-malware. You also have a SIEM which is what we sort of referenced before. A lot of our customers and other customers put in data loss prevention rules. There's some configuration settings you have to do, but that's really the bulk of it. And also multi-factor authentication. Those are sort of the big ticket items from a technology standpoint. And I will tell you that I'd say the vast majority of people, and I'll let Redspin, comment on this too, the vast majority of our customers definitely, and different people I've talked to in the industry, already have some of this, if not all of it, already in place anyway, as part of their cyber hygiene that they're already doing. So I think that a lot of people get really overwhelmed by, oh my gosh, the endpoint is everywhere and I have to keep it secure. And yes, you absolutely do, but it's really a much more manageable process, I think, than a lot of people think it is, just at first blush.
And even if you happen to be one of those people who are terrorized by the word endpoint controls, what help can somebody like PreVeil or an external organization provide to reduce your level of terror?
Absolutely. So I know from the PreVeil side, we have a full endpoint checklist. We are always here to walk you through. I walk customers through how to set up those things all the time. We're also going to expand out and even have a whole course on endpoints and how to set them up compliantly. So yeah, and then there's also, of course, there's always consultants you can work with who can help you. And of course, managed service providers, those external service providers we mentioned before. PreVeil has a huge network of partners, thanks to Jamie, who manages our partner network of MSPs, MSSPs, and those people who can help you with those endpoint management controls if you need it.
Is this some kind of rocket science to achieve endpoint controls, or is this like in the grasp of, relative human beings?
I feel like a relatively savvy person is going to have no problems, and somebody who maybe is not IT focused may have a little bit of stumble, but truly, I think that it's definitely doable by anybody. Yeah.
And my last question goes to you, Jamie. The other thing that was clarified in the regulation was regarding virtual desktop infrastructure. What's a VDI and what are the rule clarifications that apply to them?
Sure. So virtual desktop infrastructure is essentially when you're accessing what will most likely be a cloud service where you're hosting your CUI and the CUI is being processed. And you're simply logging in from a laptop, desktop, through a keyboard and mouse into the virtual desktop infrastructure. And that's where the storing, processing, and transmission of CUI is occurring. In that case, the endpoint that you're accessing the VDI infrastructure from is now deemed out of scope, so long as you properly configure the VDI so that none of the storage, processing, transmitting of that VDI infrastructure, of the CUI on that VDI infrastructure, can ever be brought down to your laptop. So don't allow local saves, don't allow to copy and paste to the local infrastructure. As long as you can do that, that endpoint is completely now out of scope for your assessment.
Absolutely.
You're shaking your head.
Yes, that's absolutely.
If I may, the VDI itself, we want to make sure it's understood. It has to be the infrastructure. It has to be fully compliant with 800-171. It needs to meet the endpoint controls that we spoke about. The only thing that is being said over here is if you use your regular computer to log into the VDI, that regular computers are a scope, but you now have to have a fully compliant VDI. Am I being correct in that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then now I normally stop at 2:00 sharp, but I will give one more minute to our friends at Redspin. Any surprises that you saw in the CFR 32 final rule?
Yeah, so I guess I'll kick this off because you're getting a lot. First of all, for all the attendees out here, you've got some great questions, folks. I'm thoroughly enjoying the chat sessions and answering the questions. First, let me address the changes in the rule. The big one that affected us C3PAOs was the requirement now for two CCAs, the CMMC certified assessors, to be on the assessments. For us at Redspin, we only leverage 2 assessors per assessment. So that really, for us, took our CCPs out of our plan of putting them on the assessments. That was one of the biggest things. For the folks that are have a lot of questions and answers, it's a lot of questions about PreVeil. So if I may, when you leverage PreVeil, PreVeil is a cloud service provider. PreVeil does not have a FedRAMP authorization. They have a FedRAMP equivalency. So what does that mean for you folks that are leveraging PreVeil right now as your CSP? PreVeil has what they call a body of evidence. When you sign up with them, that body of evidence, that folder containing all those documents of stuff they must meet in order to be equivalent, is passed to you, the users, their clients. You must read through those and make the determination if yes, they are good. When you come for certification, that body of evidence becomes a part of your assessment package. The assessors review it, deem it's okay, you continue on with your process. That's any cloud service provider you're leveraging that is equivalent. If they have a FedRAMP authorization, the only thing you need from them is a responsibility matrix, which you as the organization have the onus to review to ensure they're doing all they're supposed to do and you're doing all you're supposed to do. And then the assessors review that as well. I will tell you that cloud service, we're seeing a lot of folks shifting to clouds. I think it's an amazing idea. We see a lot of manufacturers doing that because they're on-prem and their heavy-duty CAD solutions just bog everything down. So they keep those on-prem, put the CUI in the cloud like PreVeil, and they're happy off and running, and it's maintainable and sustainable over the 3-year periods.
I can't thank you enough, Robert and Thomas and Noel and Jamie, for participating and answering questions. So with that, thank you so very much to everybody that attended. And if we can be in assistance in getting you compliant, we're here to help. Thank you.